This is Dr. James Strickler, and this lecture concerns Chapter 18, Life in Industrial America, in the United States History textbook, American Yawp. We'll begin this chapter by discussing the example of Chicago as a place where industrial America transformed the community. Chicago, during this time period that we're discussing, between the American Civil War and the early 1900s, became the meatpacking center for the United States of America. There, 5 big meatpacking firms, forming a cartel, in other words, they cooperated together to control the market, provided 4/5 of the meat bought by American consumers. This meat came to Chicago on rail lines from the west, from the Great Plains, where there were vast herds of cattle being raised. It was that those cattle were unloaded into the Union stockyards, a mile square area of land with nothing but pens of cattle ready to be moved into the slaughterhouses. They'd be there just for a short time and replaced by more cattle. It was a huge, stinky enterprise. Being the center of the movement of meat from the plains to the dinner tables on the East Coast led to phenomenal growth in Chicago, once the railroads had allowed this connection. You can see on these diagrams here how Chicago's population spread out over the course of about 80 years. During that time period, Chicago underwent phenomenal population growth. When the city was first chartered in 1837, there were only about 4,000 residents. By 1860, there were over 100,000. By 1870, around 300,000. But then the railroads came. By 1900, there were 1.7 million people living in Chicago. By 1910, there were 2.2 million people living in Chicago. No other city in world history has seen such phenomenally fast population growth. Many of these people that came to Chicago and caused its numbers to grow were immigrants. By around 1900, 80% of the population of the city of Chicago were either immigrants or the children of immigrants. This intense population growth in Chicago continued despite the Chicago fire in 1871, which destroyed about 1/3 of the city. It could endure such a major catastrophe because of the incredible economic pressures for Chicago to succeed. It was the gateway from the food-producing regions in the middle of the continent to the food-consuming regions on the East Coast. So it didn't matter that a fire destroyed much of the city. Chicago was going to continue to grow as the epicenter of this transfer of resources from one region to another. Now, we talk about this about Chicago at the beginning of this chapter as an incredible example of the kind of growth that was taking place all over the country. Railroads had connected cities all over the place, allowing the buying and selling of goods to take place efficiently. Immigrants were flooding into the country, into cities where they would take jobs in factories. And so America's population grew along with its capacity to do business. Chicago was just the most extreme example of it, but it was taking place everywhere. One of the things that made possible this vast increase in production during this time period after the Civil War was technological innovation. Of course, we've discussed previously in this course and other chapters the vast expansion of the railroads during this time period. During the era of the Civil War, the amount of railroads in the country tripled, and this was despite the Union Army tearing up railroads in the South. It tripled because we needed to move troops and their supplies from one place to another, and railroads were the most efficient way to do it. But even after the Civil War, the railroads continued to expand. During the time period from 1870 to 1890, the number of miles of railroad in the country again tripled. As the railroads stretched across the country, they had a problem to deal with. The problem was that of time. You see, time is actually a function of where the sun is in the sky. When the sun is directly overhead, that is noon for the location where you are. But the problem is that when noon comes is slightly later as you move from east to west. Where towns a few miles apart, if they just go by where the sun is in the sky, will actually have noon at a different time. And thus their clocks will be set differently and all the times of the day will be different. Well, this is a problem for railroads who are trying to set uniform schedules of where their trains will be at what time, so that customers can know and know when to show up at the station. So the railroads, for their purposes, created uniform time zones, as you can see on this map. They created 4 stretching across the country. All cities within the orange to the east would have the same time. All cities in the purple would have the same time. All the cities in the green would have the same time. And on the west coast, all the cities in the red would have the same time. Each of them would be an hour apart from the other. So while it might be noon in New York City, it would be 11 o'clock in Chicago, 10 o'clock in Salt Lake City in Utah, and 9 o'clock in San Francisco, California. The railroads did this in 1883 to make it easier for them to move their rail cars from one place to another. Well, the cities around them adapted in order to match up with the train schedule. And pretty soon, by default, the country had been divided into these 4 time zones, with everyone using them. It wasn't until 1918 that the United States Congress actually instituted time zones by law. Now, the exact boundaries of those time zones have been altered over time, but we still have these 4 basic time zones even today. The railroads connecting the entire country not only meant that we had to have time in common, but it also created national markets for goods. This meant that you could raise something or build something in one part of the country while your customers could be on the other side of the country, because you could transport everything there by rail fairly cheaply. This then created a national economy. Everything was interconnected. So if business went bad in California, it might affect businesses in New York. We would rise or sink together. It also created a national culture, as the railroad line itself meant that people could move from one place to another and bring their customs and ideas and accents with them and meld in with the other ones where they moved. But they also meant that they could share entertainment with each other. Traveling performers could move from one place to another, and that way they could share these common forms of entertainment across the country. In time, the American culture would become unified, and it still is becoming more and more unified to this day because of transportation, but also because of communication. Railroads brought communication from one part of the country to another, as they could carry newspapers, letters, other various reports. But also telegraph wires were strung along with the railroads, which allowed communication to be instantaneous from one side of the continent to the other. So information, news could be immediately shared and embraced and understood and reacted to by all at the same time. These railroads and other industries became such vast enterprises that no longer could the owners at the top of the business really deal with the unskilled laborers at the bottom. Instead, they needed a new middle layer in between, a bureaucratic layer. A bureaucracy is any sort of collection of workers, whether it be in a government office, at a university, or at a private business, who are in this middle level, who basically spend their days processing paperwork, making sure that records are properly being kept, that rules are properly being followed. They don't do the actual work of production, they supervise those who do, and then report to the people in charge. These laborers and these bureaucracies had to be better educated than the workers on the assembly line. And they also came to work dressed differently. They came dressed in white suit collars and wore ties, that they didn't have to worry about getting caught in the machinery, as the laborers on the assembly line might have to worry about. They became known as white-collar workers. Because of their greater education and their responsibility over lots of people, they were paid more than the common workers who had to work by hand within the factory. This then led to the emergence of a middle class in the United States. They were neither rich nor poor, but they earned comfortable livings in between. In this changing America that was changed by the railroads, as I already pointed out, Chicago had a particular importance in the nationalization of the food supply. Now, Chicago wasn't the only place that this was going on, but again, it's the best example. Agricultural products, such as wheat and beef, were raised in the Great Plains and to the west. They were shipped to Chicago, where they were processed, such as the Chicago stockyards, and then they were sent on to consumers in the east to be consumed, such as at a fancy steakhouse in New York City. So you would have a cow that was raised in, let's say, Nebraska, who ends up being slaughtered in Chicago, its meat sent on a refrigerated rail car to New York and served to a customer there. This sort of thing became common in the country during this time period. While the meat was in Chicago, it was processed like any other industrial product, using an assembly line. These pictures in the background here show the processing of pigs. How they come in one door, they're killed, they're hung up, their blood is drained, and then they're moved on to a bath to loosen up their skin so it can be removed, etc., until they're finally chopped up, processed, and sent out the door as packaged meat. This is a process like any other process in a factory, with people doing discrete, small tasks repetitively all day long, thus making it more efficient, thus allowing huge quantities of meat to be processed there in Chicago. This is how they managed to process 4/5 of the meat being consumed in the country. Well, those disassembly plants, where they, rather than assembling a car, disassembled a pig or something else, were not the only thing that made Chicago important. Yes, it was important that we had the Chicago stockyards where the meat was processed and moved through. But something else was important happening in Chicago. To connect the agriculture in the West to the consumers in the East, you needed money to set up these big production and slaughter plants in Chicago. In other words, you needed capital. And people saw this as an opportunity to invest. The capital could come from anywhere. It could come from an investor in California or an investor in New York. But they provided money to set up the factories in Chicago to process the meat. Well, this is an example of what was happening all over the country, but again, particularly in Chicago. This is a way that Chicago was a place where you could have agriculture, capital, and consumers all be connected to have an efficient process of moving products to customers. It wasn't just the railroad lines that intersected at Chicago that were an important technological change that transformed America. There was also a series of inventions. Most prominently were those made by Thomas Edison, who was a professional inventor. Now, he was obviously a bright man that came up with many great ideas, but he didn't do it all on his own. Instead, his great genius was to set up an invention factory in Menlo Park, New Jersey. He brought in many smart men, and he would come to them with a problem that needed to be solved, such as, we need to produce an electric light bulb. They would then go through hundreds or thousands of different versions and attempts till they found the one that actually worked. Since they all worked for Thomas Edison, in the end, when he finally did produce an efficient light bulb, he got credit for it, rather than the worker who strung the string in the bulb that actually finally worked. Thomas Edison's early inventions that were most significant were the electric light bulb that I just described. But that is not the only one, because once he had invented the light bulb, he had to have a way to power it. And so he also invented a power generation system. Then he began building power plants across the country in hundreds of cities to produce the power that could then be sent to people's homes by wires, which would then allow them to buy his electric light bulbs. Here you see a patent filed by Thomas Edison for the electric bulb, and you see another patent filed by him for a power generator. The purpose of patents is to gain for the inventor the exclusive right to produce the product for a certain number of years. This allows the inventor to profit off his invention, and it thus encourages people to invent. Without patents, if somebody invented a new thing and they didn't have exclusive rights to produce it, then everyone would just copy their patent, some cheaper, and the inventor would never make any money off of it. And therefore the inventor would have no incentive to invent. But patents exist. Thomas Edison took advantage of them. Over his lifetime, he patented more than 1,000 inventions. Thomas Edison's creation of electric lights and electric power allowed for what we can call the second industrial revolution. Now that lights could be used to light the night and the interiors of buildings, businesses could operate 24 hours a day. Consumers could consume into the night. But also new kinds of machines could be created with far greater power than could be produced merely by steam power or even by burning petroleum products like coal and gas. Yes, we might use those to produce the electricity to begin with, but once the electricity is produced, it can provide consistent, effective power for giant machines in factories to produce things. While the first industrial revolution took place in the early 1800s and turned us into a manufacturing society, the second industrial revolution turned the United States into an industrial powerhouse in the world. To man these factories, we needed more workers, and more workers were happy to come into the country from overseas. They flooded into big cities, leading to phenomenal growth in the size of cities during this time period. Here on the left, you can see that in 1860, there are about 4 times as many people living in rural America, in other words, out in the countryside, as in urban America, in other words, in the cities. But by 1920, there were more people living in cities than were living in the countryside. In 60 years, America had transformed from a rural population to an urban population. Along the way, some cities had phenomenal growth, such as Chicago that I already talked about, which you can see in the right-hand side of the screen. This growth in the cities was caused a great deal by an influx of immigrants. Now, on this chart, the most important thing to pay attention to is the blue line. The blue line is showing the percentage of population in the United States that is made up of immigrants at a given time. And you can see during this time period, from the 1870s up through the 1920s, that around somewhere between 10 and 15% of the population of the United States is made of first-generation immigrants. We have not seen that level until just recent times, as we now have immigrants flooding into the country from Mexico and Central America. This influx of immigrants would transform America. They not only would provide laborers for the factory, but they would bring their cultural distinctiveness with them and add it to our own. During the first big wave of immigration, early in the 1800s, immigrants came in primarily from Germany and Ireland. And we've talked about in a previous chapter about that. This new wave of immigration brought immigrants still from those places, but from other places too. Lots of Italians, Poles, Eastern European Jews, people from other places such as Sweden and that would come to America also. America was seen as a land of opportunity that they flooded into. And that's the thing to keep in mind, is that the reason immigrants came to America is that they knew they could earn a better living for themselves here. They might be destitute in Europe, but if they could scrounge together enough money to get a ship ticket, they could come to America, get a job, and make a better life for themselves. It might be a hard life to begin with, but they knew that they could then pass on that better life to their children that would have an even better life after them. These immigrants that flooded into the country settled in big cities, and they oftentimes gathered in ethnic neighborhoods. There's an obvious reason for this. If you get off of a boat and you don't speak English, but you that there's others around that speak your native language, whether it be Italian or Polish or whatever, You will go try to find them, and there you'll find help. They'll help you get an apartment, they'll help you get a job, etc. So these groups of people lived amongst each other. In their neighborhood, they might continue to speak their native language, such as Italian, with their friends and neighbors and in their home. But when they went to work, they would learn English. So they slowly integrated into America. The map on the right shows the places with the densest populations of immigrants. Now, the map can be a little misleading. The darker areas show the most immigrants. But in some cases, when there is a very small population already there, such as the northern part of the map, Minnesota, North Dakota, just a few immigrants moving in from Sweden, which actually happened, can then form a big percentage of the population, even though it's a relatively small number. A better thing is to look at the East Coast, where you have cities like Boston and New York that are also in that dark, dark red. These places have huge populations. Yes, yet a massive part of that population was made up of immigrants. The immigrants that came then, after having established their better life in America, called for their families to follow them. This led to chain migration. You get one person here, and then they get their legal status, they get a job, and then they get others to come. Chain migration still takes place today. This is one of the reasons why you'll have pregnant women who will try to get into the United States to have babies so that their children can become American citizens, and then they can legally invite the parents to actually join them. A few years ago, there was a hotel in San Francisco where a huge bust took place because the hotel wasn't actually a hotel. It was a place where illegal Chinese immigrants, pregnant women from China, would come to have babies so that their babies could be Americans and then the rest of the family could come legally. Those are called anchor babies. And the process of one generation coming and then inviting another generation, then inviting another generation and being the legal sponsors of them is called chain migration today. Well, it happened back then, although those kind of tricks were not needed. Instead, what would happen is someone would come from a family, they would have success in America, and they would invite others to come. And they came in waves related to each other, who would then move into these ethnic neighborhoods that I've already mentioned. As these immigrants came, they then fell into what has been described as the American melting pot. Here's a cartoon illustrating this concept. On the right, you have immigrants entering America of various nationalities. There's people in this picture even from places like India and Turkey, among other places. They come in one end, and Uncle Sam, representing the United States of America, turns a big crank, and out pops on the other side people looking like typical Americans with their citizenship in hand. So this is the idea that when people come to America, they come to not remain separate people, even though they may be that way for a time as they gravitate to people like themselves and speak their own languages. Eventually, they'll melt into the common group of Americans. They'll become Americans just like anybody else. I'll use myself as a personal example of this. My last name, Strickler, is a German name. My ancestors immigrated from the German-speaking part of Switzerland a long time ago. Well, I don't even think about myself being a German. No, I'm an American. I have no connection to Germany or to Switzerland. And that's what happens with many immigrants along the way. They just melt into the rest of America. This has become a controversial way of describing America today, because many people don't want immigrants to give up their distinctiveness and become Americans like anyone else. But this is still the natural process. This is particularly a natural process when immigration gets cut off from a place. When you don't have a continuing influx of new immigrants from, let's say, Italy, who are coming in speaking Italian, then there isn't much reason for the people of Italian descent who are living here to continue to speak Italian. They'll learn to speak English like everybody else, and within a short time, they'll just be indistinguishable Americans. So this is actually one of the arguments made today about cutting off immigration. We have many people that have immigrated from Mexico and Central America, but they continue to live among people of their own race, their own extraction, their own language. They have not yet assimilated entirely to being Americans. But perhaps that could be accomplished by cutting off immigration from those places where they don't have a constant influx of Spanish speakers coming in. Then within a generation or two, they would simply melt in with everybody else. Life in these big cities where the immigrants lived was sometimes hard for them. As I said, they would get off a boat, they wouldn't speak the language, they wouldn't have a job, and they would go to the ethnic neighborhoods looking for help. But sometimes help came looking for them. This was oftentimes in the form of urban political machines. Okay, urban refers to big cities. A political machine is a group of people that use the mechanisms of government to keep themselves in power and to keep themselves getting rich. The most famous example of an urban political machine was in New York City, and this group of people was called Tammany Hall. They were called this because of a building that they met in. The building was called Tammany Hall, and they were the ones who controlled politics in the city. Their leader was a man named William Boss Tweed. The way that they controlled politics is they would get people to vote for them in exchange for certain goods or services. So, for example, an immigrant would get off the boat, not know anyone, not speak the language, not have a job, and a representative of Tammany Hall would meet them at the docks. The representative would then say, hey, speaking their language, I'll find you a place to live. I'll help you get a job. In exchange for that, in a couple of years when you become a citizen, you're going to vote for who I tell you to vote for. Do we have a deal? Another way that the machines would make money is by providing services for neighborhoods. Hey, if they need a street repaved, Tammany Hall can arrange that. They can arrange that if the people in that neighborhood agree to all vote for who they say to vote for. Now, the way Tammany Hall got rich off of this is that as they moved the money around, which they could since they controlled the government, they would take a cut of it. This is dishonest. This is illegal. This is called graft. One of the ways they did this was through what are called kickbacks. So say Tammany Hall decided it was time to build a bridge. They would then use government money to build the bridge, and they would decide who they would hire to build the bridge based on how much that company was willing to cooperate with them. So they would find a company that they would say, okay, we're going to hand you, I'll just use a round number for it, $10 million to build the bridge. But when you get that $10 million from the city of New York, what you're going to do is you're going to hand $1 million back to us at Tammany Hall. Well, if you don't want to do that, then you'll never get the $10 million in the first place because we decide where the money goes. So this kind of graft, which from our modern point of view, we would view as always dishonest, the politicians of the time did not necessarily think so. They thought there was a difference between honest graft and dishonest graft. Dishonest graft was when a politician just used their power to take money from people while giving nothing in exchange. Honest graft was when, yes, they got money from the people, but they actually delivered things to the people that the people need. Like, for example, finding the immigrant a job, or, for example, actually repaving the road in the neighborhood, or actually building the bridge that connected different parts of the city. Their argument was, yes, we're getting rich off of this, but we're giving the people what we need. And amazingly, some modern studies done by political scientists and economists have found that these political machines were actually probably more efficient at delivering goods and services to the citizens than our modern governments, which are not nearly as corrupt. Now, if you were among those who managed to make an upper middle class living in these big cities, maybe you wouldn't want to be stuck in one of the crowded neighborhoods. And so you would find a better life just outside the city in suburban communities. These are communities primarily constructed for people to live in, not work in. They are quiet neighborhoods away from the hustle and bustle and factories, where families felt that they could quietly raise their children in a good environment. Suburbs began to grow in this time period as an escape for those who could escape from the big cities. Another important development that took place during the half-decade after the Civil War and Reconstruction up through the early 1900s was the transformation of the South. This transformation was advocated by people who wanted to create a new South. As we discuss the creation of the New South, we need to remind ourselves of what happened after the Civil War. There was the period of Reconstruction when the South was occupied by Union armies that tried to enforce the ideals of the radical Republicans. But eventually, to resolve the controversy over the election of 1876, the Compromise of 1877 called for the withdrawal of federal troops from the South. This then allowed the Democratic Redeemers to take charge of cities in the South. These were members of the Democratic Party who wanted to, as much as possible, reinstitute the race relations that existed during the time of slavery. They, of course, could not return people to slavery, but they could try to impose things that would bring about as near a condition of slavery as possible. One of the ways they did this was through social terrorism. The greatest example of a group engaging in this was the Ku Klux Klan, which we've mentioned previously in this course. The Ku Klux Klan tried to intimidate free blacks to not participate in politics so that the whites could run the system as they saw fit. But it was not just those sorts of formal organizations that went around harassing the blacks in the South. It was an act of the entire culture at times. An example of this were vigilante lynchings. Some black man would be accused of some dreadful crime. Dreadful enough that the white population would rise up, track the person down, and hang him without a trial. These sorts of vigilante acts of justice were called lynchings, and they became common enough throughout the South that just about every southern city of any size has some sort of story in its history of this kind of thing happening. One of the primary causes of lynchings was a claim that a black man had raped a white woman. This was the greatest fear of the white population, that black men were trying to hunt and prey upon white women. This is probably a leftover of the time of slavery, when the slave masters actually took advantage of their slave women sexually, but then feared that the slave men would do the same to their own wives. So this became a great cultural fear in the South. While undoubtedly there were some occasions when it actually did happen, most of these lynchings were not real events like that. The mere accusation was enough to get a man killed. So throughout the South, this vigilante justice was oftentimes not actually just. It left blacks intimidated, realizing that they had to be extra careful in their relationships around whites, because again, the mere accusation of behaving badly in this way, whether true or not, could lead into a person being killed. In the South, they also imposed racial segregation, where blacks and whites were expected to not use the same facilities, at least not at the same time. So, you might have white restaurants and black restaurants. You also might have a swimming pool, a public swimming pool that certain days was used by whites and certain days was used by blacks. These segregation regulations were known as Jim Crow laws. Sometimes they were in fact imposed by the government, they were an actual law. Sometimes they were just enacted by private individuals who did not want the races to mix. In the South, there were also miscegenation laws that prohibited interracial marriage. This goes back to the fear of white men in the South about their white women being taken advantage of sexually by black men. They simply made marriage between the races illegal to prevent this kind of thing. The white majority also tried to make sure that blacks couldn't influence elections by intimidating black voters to not vote. This was done both through physical violence, such as shown in the picture here, but also through economic threats. A black man might be told that he would lose his job on a farm and have no way to feed his family if he showed up to vote. Voter suppression was also systematized through poll taxes, where there was a requirement that a person pay a tax to be able to vote, and literacy tests, where a person was required to demonstrate that they could read and write to be able to vote. These sorts of measures disproportionately affected black citizens. Now, they could be claimed to be neutral laws that applied to both blacks and whites, but whites were more likely to have the money to pay to vote, more likely to be able to pass the literacy test. And even if they weren't able to do these things, one of two things was the case. Either they were poor whites and thus of not very much concern to the wealthy white majority, or not wealthy white majority, the wealthy white minority that was running things, or they were allowed to vote anyway under what were called grandfather clauses, where somebody was allowed to vote without paying the tax, without taking the test, if their grandfather had been eligible to vote. Well, a white man's grandfather could vote, but not a black man's. The black man's grandfather was a slave. So these poll taxes and literacy tests disproportionately prevented blacks from voting, even though on the surface they appeared to be neutral laws. Well, they were intentionally designed that way. After the loss in the Civil War, the ego of the South had been greatly bruised. South was a place built on honor and courage, and yet they had lost the war. And so there was a concerted effort during the 50 years after Reconstruction ended to restore the confidence of people in the South. One of the ways this was done was through what some historians call the lost cause mythology. Now, I think that the people who describe it this way are only getting part of the picture right. So let me explain. The way the lost cause mythology is described by critics of it is that they think that advocates of the lost cause mythology are telling a lie about what motivated the South to go to war. And that lie is something they call states' rights. That in the lost cause mythology, that Southerners argue that they did not go to war because of the slaves. They went to war because the national government was invading the powers of the states, and that the states had to stand up against that, which is why they withdrew from the Union. Now, people who are critical of the Southerners making this sort of argument dismiss it as false and say they just need to admit that the real reason was about slavery and racism. I think the truth is part both. Yes, the Southerners wanted to maintain their slave culture, but their slave culture was only under threat because of the national government potentially invading the powers of the states. So both are true. The South did want to preserve the power of the states, but yes, they wanted to preserve it so they could maintain slavery. Now, what this meant was that in this aftermath, the South could emphasize the lost cause, the idea that they had fought a just war, that they had fought to preserve the rights of states, which they could argue was constitutionally the correct argument even though they failed, that they were on the morally right side in defending the power of the states. So this was a way for them to restore their feelings about themselves, that they were justified to go to war even if they lost. Their cause was just even if they lost. So to try to emphasize this, they held up their Confederate fighters as heroes to the cause of states' rights. Even though they failed, they were heroes to fight the good fight. They built monuments around the South for them. They're the same monuments that in the year 2020 were being torn down by activists. A group that sponsored a bunch of these monuments were the United Daughters of the Confederacy. These were women who wanted to restore the confidence of their husband. They wanted to stroke the bruised ego of the man that had failed to win the Civil War. They wanted the South to feel manly and strong again. In 1905, a man named Thomas Dixon published a novel called The Klansman. In 1915, a filmmaker, David Griffith, turned that novel into a film, Birth of a Nation. This was one of the biggest, most expensive, most extravagant movies ever made, and it became a sensation in the country. But the message that it carried was a controversial one. It essentially portrayed the Ku Klux Klan as heroes of the period after the Civil War. It emphasized the idea of the northern carpetbaggers that came to South to take advantage of the fact that Southerners that had joined the Confederacy were not allowed to participate in politics during the time of Reconstruction and occupation. It emphasized that free black men rose up and took power during this time period when white men couldn't vote. And then it argued that these groups took advantage of the Southerners, that the carpetbaggers and the free black men abused their power to take advantage of the resources of men in the South and take advantage of the innocence of women. And it was against this that the Ku Klux Klan rose up, that they were defenders of the virtue of Southern manhood and Southern womanhood, that they were the good guys in the story. Now, of course, this was propaganda. The Ku Klux Klan did what, from our modern standards, were evil things to go out and attack black people and intimidate them, to stop them from exercising their constitutional rights. But this portrayal of them as heroes had a profound effect upon the country. The Klan, which had been decreasing in numbers, suddenly had a resurgence. Not only a resurgence, but it spread around the country to other places too. Even in my home state of Oregon, the Klan became important, even though there were very few black people in Oregon. Instead there, it fought against Catholics, something that we will talk about toward the end of this chapter. But for right now, the thing to know, not the end of this chapter, the end of the next chapter. But for right now, the thing to know is that the Klansmen and the birth of the nation were propaganda that tried to change the country's view of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, even as some people were trying to preserve the Old South as much as possible, there were advocates for transforming the South into a new South. They wanted it to become more like the North. And one of the ways that they thought this would happen would by better connecting it to the commerce of a country as a whole. So advocates of the New South wanted to spend money on building railroads and paved roads throughout the South to allow better transportation, so that the South could be interconnected among itself, but also connected to the West, connected to the North, that there'd be more free travel between these places, more ideas exchanged, and the South would become more like those places. With improved transportation, Southern industries could then flourish. Now, of course, cotton remained the most important crop in the South. Before the Civil War, it was the most important crop to the United States as a whole, and it remained very important. But other industries were added too. In places like North Carolina, furniture building and textile weaving became important industries that employed lots of people. In places like Virginia, tobacco farming continued to flourish. In places like Alabama, steel production became important. These southern industries began to transform the South from a purely agrarian system to one more concerned with manufacturing, thus making it more like its northern neighbors. As industry got going in the South, then many people at the bottom of the economic ladder could make a transition from subsistence farming, such as sharecroppers, to working the low-paid jobs in factories, which they considered actually a move up. Now, we've talked about sharecropping before in this course, how after the slaves were freed and they sought jobs, they would go to a plantation, and the plantation owner figured out that he could limit his liability by, instead of hiring them as employees, giving them land to work that he then got a percentage of the profits from. Well, it wasn't just the free blacks that became sharecroppers. Many poor whites became sharecroppers too. These groups could then move into the factories and there have better wages, more regular hours, and they thought they could make a better living. But they were not making very much money, which means that while on the farm the whole family had to work, once they moved into the factories, oftentimes the whole family had to work also. Women and children got jobs in the factories too. Children were particularly important in textile factories, where they could move amongst the complicated weaving equipment and keep it maintained. So women and child labor became important throughout the South during this time period too. The jobs that the people were getting were racially segregated, though. Remember Jim Crow. So when black men applied for jobs at the factories, they might be given them, but they would be given the worst, lowest paying jobs. The better jobs were reserved for whites. Black women had trouble finding any jobs at all. When they did find jobs, they were mostly as domestic help, working as nannies for children, working as maids in household, working as custodians in buildings, that sort of thing. The last section of this chapter deals with gender, religion, and culture, and it's a mixture of a bunch of different things to talk about. Let's begin by talking about the culture of the most wealthy people in society. Remember, this is the Gilded Age, the time of the robber barons, where people are extremely wealthy, people like Andrew Carnegie. And Andrew Carnegie thought that he had an obligation to give away much of his wealth to help those less fortunate within him. This became a trend among the ultra wealthy to do their extravagance, not just in the way they dressed and the homes they lived in and the food they ate, but extravagance in the charitable donations that they made. Andrew Carnegie thought that this was an obligation of them all, a moral obligation, a religious obligation. He wrote a book about it called The Gospel of Wealth. But rich people giving money away, believe it or not, was controversial. Some people thought that it was tainted money. An example told about in the chapter was that Standard Oil, the oil company owned by John D. Rockefeller, which made him the richest man in the world, gave a chunk of money to the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. It gave money to Christian missionaries to spread the gospel around the world. Well, some people thought that the missionaries should not take this money because Rockefeller had earned the money through underhanded means, through acting immorally, through taking advantage of people, through his oil monopoly. And so there was a debate about whether charitable groups, I mean groups trying to receive charity, should accept charity from the wealthy. The cartoon on the right shows Andrew Carnegie split into two people. On one side, he's telling a worker at one of his mills that he's going to have to pay him less, that he's going to have a pay cut. On the other side, he's handing out charity to people. Well, which is the real on Andrew Carnegie? Is it the guy taking advantage of his workers or the guy giving out charity? Well, while this was controversial, most groups in the end took the money. As people moved into the big cities to take jobs and the populations grew, this allowed for anonymity in those urban settings. What is meant by that is that if you moved into a big city, you could get lost there where basically nobody knows you unless you want them to know you. Unlike a small town where you end up seeing each other all the time and you come to know who each other is, there are so many people in a city that everyone pretty much stops looking at each other. You walk through a crowd and they're all just faceless people. You can disappear in a big city if you want to. And now, once that nobody knows who you are, you can explore whatever sort of desires you might have, including sexual desires, without any recrimination. You won't have your family around to look down upon you or people from your church or whatever, because they won't know what you're doing. This allowed for experimentation and exploitation in the big city along these lines. The big cities also provide a place for rebellious youth to try new things. An example of this was fashion. During the period of the Gilded Age, it was also called a Victorian era. And what is meant by that is that there was a queen in England during this time named Queen Victoria. And in England, they developed a certain culture where women were expected to act respectfully and modestly at all times. They were supposed to have grace and good manners and dress very conservatively. But this could change if you were a young person and wanted to be rebellious. Instead of wearing the corset that your mother did, you would wear looser clothing. Instead of wearing the long dress your mother wore, you would wear shorter dresses. This was an act of rebellion. You can still see this to this day, where youths, teenagers, will wear some clothing which may seem just frankly ridiculous to an older person, just as an action to show that they don't have to obey the rules from the older people. And this could be particularly done in the big cities. Remember the anonymity of the big cities. And there's thus a constant energy of trying new things and experimentation, including youth not obeying what their parents have done, not following their parents' example, striking off and trying new things, including dressing in new ways. In the big city, women felt empowered to go out and engage in new things, to become advocates for causes. The biggest cause that they engaged in was the women's temperance movement. Now, eventually, as we move into the early 1900s, their fight for suffrage, the right to vote, will become the most important movement. But in the late 1800s, women's temperance was the most important. And it was a cause that continued on even during the time of women's suffrage. Women felt that men were getting too drunk too often, as even liquor production became more efficient, thus lowering the price of booze, thus allowing men to get drunk more often. And so they started a moral cause against liquor, saying that it harmed families, it harmed them as wives, it harmed children. Women activists also began to create what were called settlement houses. These were large homes created in poor neighborhoods, where middle class and wealthy people could come and safely live, and the hope was share some of their wisdom with the poor people in the neighborhood. They could set an example for them of what you could achieve with hard work. They could teach them things like child care, sanitation. They could teach them schools. They could help them with medical needs. They could hopefully be a good example that could improve the neighborhoods in which they were built. Women during this time period were still primarily responsible for raising children. But as mass media came into being and ideas could be shared, there was a movement toward women practicing what was known as scientific motherhood. Well, what is scientific motherhood? It's the idea that women should listen to experts about how to raise their own children. Yes, they are the responsible party to raise the kids, but they should get a knowledge of how to do that from experts. Well, what sort of experts? Well, they might look to doctors about how to feed their children. They might look to psychologists about how to discipline their children, things like that. Unfortunately, many of the things that were being held up as scientific truths at this time in that regard haven't remained so over time. So, for example, during this time period, doctors might advocate that a mother should bottle feed her children so that they could get consistent nutrition and not become overly attached physically to their mother. We now know today that breast milk is by far the best thing for children. So the experts weren't always right, but women were encouraged to follow their advice. Now, there were some women that challenged the norms of Victorian society. The idea that women should be prim and proper, that they should be modest, etc. Among these were Charlotte Gilman, who wrote a story called The Yellow Wallpaper, and Kate Chopin, who wrote a novel titled The Awakening. Both of them argued that this Victorian ideal of women was actually oppressive, that it led to women having depression and malaise, and that it needed to be challenged. Now, they may not have had a great effect at the time, but ideas like this were the beginning of the feminist movement that would actually eventually transform how women thought they would needed to conduct their lives. At the same time that women were trying to become more aggressive, men were arguably becoming wimpier. There was a great concern at the time about the withering of American manhood. Let me give you an example of this sort of criticism. This was made by a United States Supreme Court justice named Oliver Wendell Holmes. He described men in America at that time, particularly those living in big cities, as black-coated, stiff-jointed, soft-muscled, and paste-complexioned. In other words, they had become a bunch of scrawny little wimps that were given to things like depression, indigestion, hypochondriacism, and nervousness. Well, makers of medicine tried to come up with tonics to combat this, what they called Americanitis. where rather than walking around as a wimpy little nervous person, you could take this medication and become a manly man again. The blame for all this was the over-civilization of people. No longer were they out working hard jobs in the countryside. Instead, they were working in offices behind desks with artificial lighting. They were becoming effeminate from this. To combat against this, a particular view of Christianity began to take hold, known as Muscular Christianity. The idea that Christians didn't have to be wimpy, that Jesus was a strong man, that he had been a carpenter before becoming a religious figure, and that his followers should be similar, strong and healthy, virile. This idea of muscular Christianity found expression in boys' clubs that were often associated with churches. Today, the most common organization like this is the Boy Scouts of America. But there were other sorts of clubs at this time. Boy brigades, the Sons of Daniel Boone, which was later renamed the Boy Pioneers, and the Woodcraft Indians. These were organizations where groups of children would be taken out from big cities into the countryside to develop their more manly skills, to learn how to hunt, how to fish, how to build fires, how to build shelters, that kind of thing. This was done to counteract the over-civilization of the city, which was leading men to not really be like men. Another organization created to combat this was the YMCA, the Young Men's Christian Association. YMCA still exists today, although they've changed their name further to call themselves the Y, distancing themselves from their Christian origins. This is an example of muscular Christianity. YMCAs were set up where young men could get together and vigorously participate in sports with each other to maintain their bodies as well as their minds and their spirits. At YMCAs, things were invented for the boys to compete in, like volleyball and basketball. This was part of a great movement where people were seen as whole beings in their spiritual lives. Christianity meant having a healthy body as well as a healthy spirit. An example of this move toward muscular Christianity were the Rough Riders, of whom Teddy Roosevelt was a member and leader. They were an informal military unit that trained together, that went out for frontier actions together, and eventually participated in the Spanish-American War, fighting in Cuba on behalf of the United States, even though they were not members of the regular United States Army. These were men that had actually come from soft backgrounds, rich families in big city, but they embraced the outdoor lifestyle as being healthy for them. They tried to be rugged people that could live out working hard and fighting hard in the wilderness. At the same time that this muscular Christianity was spreading around America, new entertainment forms were spreading around too. One of these was Vaudeville. Vaudeville was a group of traveling shows that would move from one town to another, stage shows where various acts would perform family-friendly entertainment. Some people became quite famous as vaudeville performers. One was Charlie Chaplin, the silent little man that would wander around being goofy on stage and would later become a silent film star. Another was Harry Houdini, an escape artist who would be locked in shackles, dunked in water, and somehow get out of his bindings. These were popular people. They became famous in the country, and this was considered one of the best forms of entertainment of the day. But a traveling show, while it might bind the country together, giving them all the same kind of entertainment, still could not bring them together in the same way that technological inventions eventually would. Let's now return to Thomas Edison and his effect upon cultural entertainment. One of Thomas Edison's invention was the phonograph, invented in 1877, which would allow noises to be recorded and played back later. This was done through etching grooves on wax tubes. The phonograph was then sold to consumers, and you would have investors buy phonographs and buy the recordings and then set up parlors in cities where people could come and listen to the recorded music. They would come in and they would pay a nickel and be able to listen to a song. By having recordings of songs, this meant that you could have multiple recordings. This meant that the same songs could be distributed all around the country to be listened to on demand. When somebody walked into a parlor and put their coin in, they could hear the same song that somebody on the other side of the country was listening to. This is what created popular music in the United States of America and eventually led to popular music stars. Thomas Edison also invented the motion picture system. He did this by first inventing what is called the kinetograph, a way to film motion pictures, which motion pictures are basically just a series of still photos shown very quickly and thus giving us the illusion of motion. Thomas Edison then in 1891 invented the kinetoscope, a mechanism for viewing these films that he had created. Now notice the kinetoscope in the picture is housed in a box and a person leans over the box to watch and listen to it. These were short films, like maybe 3 minutes long, that were shown. And the people who watched them would again pay a nickel to do so. This then led to the creation of kinetoscope arcades. But what this meant was, again, because multiple copies could be created, people over the country could watch the same things. Even things that were popular in other sorts of cultural mediums could be viewed this way. If you look at the picture on the right, there's a sign at the front of the room in the lower left-hand corner, which says, "See the Corbett fight." Boxing was a popular pastime during this era. And here, this kinetoscope arcade is advertising for its customers that they can come in and view a boxing match. That boxing match had taken place live sometime before and been recorded. Well, the people in this town would have had no chance to travel to where the boxing match took place. But now, the record of the boxing match can be brought to them and they can view it. A few years later, Thomas Edison invented the Vitascope, which allowed him to project these images onto a big screen. Now no longer would you have to lean over a box and watch your little movie just by yourself. Now you could sit in a large theater and share the experience with hundreds of other people. This not only might make for a more fun communal experience for the viewer, but it also meant that Thomas Edison could make more efficient money. Rather than getting a nickel from one person for viewing a movie, he could get a whole bunch of money from hundreds of people for a single showing of a movie. This led to him to invest in the movie industry, to send out people to film films in exotic locations around the world, such as Egypt and China, because then he could bring films home of those things, and people in towns who maybe in their entire life had never lived more than 50 miles from where they were born, they can now see what it looked like in Egypt on their own movie screen in their own hometown. Thomas Edison's movies then led to movie stars. Here's some example of important early movie stars. Mary Pickford on the left, one of the first leading ladies that made men wish that they had a wife that looked like that. Douglas Fairbanks, one of the first leading men, which made women wish that they had a husband who looked like that. These were the big movie stars. And then we had other ones like Buster Keaton. Now he has kind of an odd look on his face there, and that was his act, that he had almost no emotional reaction to everything. He would wander into bizarre situations and not react to them. He was a comedian. But they all became stars, well paid to make films to be shown to vast audiences all over the country through Thomas Edison's new technology. Not all entertainment was recorded, prearranged things like that, though. Live sports had become important too. Baseball and boxing were the most popular sports of the day. Now, you might be able to get several thousand fans in the stands for these fights, but hundreds of thousands of people over the country were interested in the results. Well, the technology of this era made it possible for them to see it too. The events could be filmed and then shown in theaters later on. People might already know who won, but they still might want to see how they actually won. And even real-time telegraph allowed for scores and results to be reported the moments they were happening. Somebody might stand outside a telegraph office and watch the score of a baseball game updated every inning, or the results of a boxing match updated every round. In this way, the country had become connected culturally through the technologies of this time. And that completes this chapter.